Hello, my name is Jonathan Forster and welcome to the Multi-Story Thinking Podcast. I'm an interior designer and educator. My job is to improve quality of life and productivity by helping people to create beautiful and practical spaces to live and work in. The Multi-Story Thinking Podcast takes an educational slant to the interior design world. So sit back, relax as we help unravel the mysteries of interior design. Today we talk to Hanieh Motamedian. Hanieh is the Business Development Manager at Sound Directions Ltd. She specialises in advising clients on the introduction of noise reduction measures and is passionate about the well-being, productivity and health benefits of managing sound effectively. I spoke to Hanieh via Zoom in the early days of the COVID lockdown. In this episode we discover the ABC of sound reduction measures, how noise clutter can reduce productivity, the importance of noise reduction in healthcare and how it can make a positive contribution to recovery, and why adding noise to an office can help to make it sound quieter. Thank you very much for joining me on the Multi-Story Thinking Podcast. Your specialism is sound, and I've been thinking about sound in relation to interior design, and it's an area that I don't think many designers really learn much about. We certainly don't teach much of it, but it's around us all, isn't it? It's a sort of thing that's, I'm just reflecting before this, that there's sound everywhere and buildings have a sound, and managing sound is your business. And just tell me a bit about what you actually do.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I'd be delighted to speak about my knowledge on what I've learned so far working in office acoustics and speaking to lots of interior designers, lots of office fit-out contractors and end users, as well as audio consultants, acoustic consultants. So I work for an engineering company, and as part of that, I work with a range of acoustic treatments, predominantly sound masking and sound absorption products. So I encourage people to consider the acoustics of a space when they're designing offices. And also I work with people who have an office already. They've just moved into a newly fitted out office, and I discuss with them fixing issues that they've noticed that they have, like speech privacy or distraction issues. So I travel around the country and I demonstrate these products and these concepts, and I try to demystify what it is basically. You know, as with something that you don't really understand it fully, the gaps in your knowledge, you either fill it with your imagination or just with fear of the topic itself.
Yeah.
So when we talk to people, I try to say, this is very simple in a way, like top level, this is very simple. These are the things you should think about, and this is what you could do. And then normally people come to their own conclusion about whether they need a certain treatment or not once they understand how it works. So my role is predominantly an educational one rather than a sales one, because I find that these treatments, you know, either you need them or you don't. It's really simple. I try and do my best to tell people about these treatments that they can do and how they might work in the spaces that they have.
I think that idea of educating is really important, because I think we all know that, particularly in an office environment, that sound is an issue, but we don't know how to deal with it other than the go-to sort of acoustic walls or the fabric divider between desks. That's about the basic entry-level stuff that most designers will be thinking is going to make a difference, but we don't actually know how it's working.
Yes.
And whether it is making a difference. I think that's the angle. You know, it's something that we probably as designers aren't able even to quantify or measure or even prove that we've made a difference.
Yes, and those treatments that you've mentioned are the visible ones. There's two main treatments for managing sound in your office. And treatments kind of makes it sound like it's after the fact, but a treatment can be something that addresses the symptoms of things even before you have the symptoms, because I work with some people who are building a building. So they're thinking about, the bricks and mortar and the lighting and the seating and the soundscape. So I work with that group of people. And then I also work with a group of people that have said, okay, well, we've just moved into this office, but I can hear everyone such and such is, I can hear everything that person is saying on the other side of the office. What can I do about that? And then I normally try to visit the places that tell me that they have a problem, because, you've just really captured there that people don't really understand this topic generally, let alone in detail. So of the treatments available, there is often confusion between what the right way forward is, because you tend to go for something So if you know about absorption panels and rafts and clouds that you can hang from the ceiling, you might go for those. And in effect, what they do is reduce the ambient noise of an office, and that might be counterproductive, because nobody really wants to sit in a dead silent office, and too much absorption has a negative effect of the soundscape being unnatural. I think in a sort of primordial sense, when something's too quiet, you think, well, what's going on? There are no birds singing. So is there a predator around? I'm feeling uncomfortable here.
Yeah.
Sort of like if you've stood in a recording room, with the foam on the walls, you can almost hear your pulse in your head at the extreme end. But yeah, knowing where to go. And all of these treatments are quantifiable, using the proper measurement equipment and science and maths. Now, a lot of people don't need that to be able to look at a space and say, this is what you need. I've done this before. This will give you a perceivable difference in the result. And one of the things I always say to people is, the more experience and knowledge you have on this, the better you'll be able to reproduce a similar result. Now, every room and office is different, because predominantly the people are different and the building is different. So some office cultures are very lively and others are more quiet, lone working, whereas some are, a bit more techie and collaborative and generally noisier. Visiting other offices is really useful. If you call upon your own experience of visiting offices, really pay attention to what you're listening to, because as you were saying, when you think about sound, we're affected by it 100% of the time, even when we're asleep and we're not aware of it. And all during that time, our brain is working to process the audio that we're experiencing, even if you're not aware of it. Our brain works very hard in the background to compensate for a lot of the things that we experience, like delays in audio, like at the cinema, for example, sitting at the front row or sitting at the back row, you still hear the audio at the same time. Eventually, after your brain kind of gets the picture's in the same place for everyone, but when the audio reaches you is slightly different. And it's the same in offices. When you are trying to concentrate, your brain is working very hard to think about what you're doing, while at the same time you can hear other conversations, but you're trying to ignore them. So that's your brain doing that. And that's why sometimes at the end of the day, you might feel fatigued without having done anything physically different than the day before.
So each space has got its own kind of inherent sound quality and components of sound. Then it's the inhabitants that give their own version or add their own version of noise to that.
Yes.
And then you've got the person or the people in the office trying to process that subconsciously, unconsciously. What are the issues that the levels of noise have on people? You're talking about your concentration levels, and immediately comes to mind, and fatigue, because what you're saying is you're whilst you're trying to work, you're also listening, and your brain is trying to process the sound around you. What are the extremes of that, and how does it impact on the people in those spaces?
Well, luckily, the extremes of noise we legislate against, like drilling or hammering.
Yeah.
They're not allowed, and they are very tightly controlled. So you have to wear ear defenders, or you have to limit your exposure time to those types of noise, because they do have a physical effect on you. But office noise isn't one that we legislate for, despite knowing that it does affect our well-being and it does contribute to work-related stress. So one of the things I noticed when you spoke was we're talking about sound and we're talking about noise. They both basically mean the same thing, but their connotations are different. So sound is something that we consider to be pleasant, like we seek good sound, we listen to music and instruments, and there are things that we enjoy listening to. They would be referred to as sound. But noise is something else. Noise implies that it's something that we don't want. Noise comes from the Latin meaning nausea. So that's, although noise and sound are often not mixed up, but interchangeably used, what we're discussing and what we're sort of looking at as the problem in offices is noise. So sometimes certain sounds can be noise, and sometimes sounds are just sound. You know, we are very temperamental beings, and sound is very subjective. So what you might enjoy one day could be the source of annoyance the next. So these things are particularly important when you're trying to concentrate on something. So you've been given a task, you have a deadline. It may be complex or not, the task that you've been given, but it's only really under these conditions that you really start to assess the battles you have to fight to be able to concentrate. So in my own experience, if I was given a complex task to achieve, I would think about booking a meeting room, or I would think about putting on my headphones and blocking out time in my diary. So visibly showing people that I'm busy by having the big headphones on. So they were a physical representation that I was busy. But also at different times of the day, different times of the week or month, different members of staff will have different priorities and different pressures. So, you know, as humans, we are very temperamental and we're not always logical. So the way sound affects us is all different. You know, there are some people who are able to hyper-focus, and there are some people that are distracted by the most minute detail. Unfortunately for me, I'm the latter. Whatever's going on, my ears prick up and I'm thinking, what's going on? Who's on the phone? Who's just knocked the doorbell? Who knocked the doorbell, pushed the doorbell? Who's on the phone? Do I need to be thinking about this? I've always been in a position where I've been part of a sales team. So I was always told that part of my role is listening out what your colleagues are up to. You know, is there anything you need to act on? So I am the type of person who is very hyper aware. You know, I've had colleagues in the past that have been able to hyper focus, and that person's phone could be ringing whilst they're looking at their computer in the middle of a complex task, and they're not even aware of the phone ringing.
Got a load of different people responding differently to the same set of sounds. And know how distracting it is when you hear somebody talking about something you're working on and thinking, oh, I'm not sure about what they've said there, or something like that. But it's the voices, but also the noises, not noises, what are the words, the actual things that are making sound, like photocopier perhaps, or people's footsteps.
Sure.
You've got a whole range of things that people are responding differently to at different times during the day and during the week.
Yes, and you've just reminded me of, do you know Marie Kondo, the
Yes.
Japanese lady?
Yes.
So she has co-authored a book with a chap called Scott, and I hope I get this pronunciation correct, Sonnenschein. He is a doctor of organizational psychology, and his research shows that clutter affects your productivity, and it also can affect your self-esteem. It can lower your self-esteem. So when we talk about noise in the office, I've now decided that clutter may be a good way to describe that. And I would liken the clutter that he refers to in his research, physical clutter affecting your productivity and your self-esteem. I could liken that to noise clutter in the office, because it does affect your productivity. That's proven, because if you can't concentrate on your work, you can't do the work. You know, it's very simple, and we all know that. You know, that sort of reinforces our common sense on the topic.
The idea of not quite knowing why you feel uncomfortable as well must be quite sort of prevalent in the sense of noise, because remember you saying earlier when we spoke last week about people not being aware that noise is impacting on them, because they just think it's a given that they have to just put up with, or they're not really hearing it, which sounds ironic.
Yeah, they're not really conscious of it. And it's true, we have, the human brain is very complex and interesting, and it does compensate for a lot of things. But noise in the office is, and this is noise that we're not legislating for, this is just office noise, printers, people chatting. According to the Leesman Index, this is the lead cause of dissatisfaction in the office. And this is something that we can manage. When I found out that the level of people that were dissatisfied with the noise in their office was so high, and was in fact the number one lead cause of dissatisfaction, I was really confused, because I always thought it would be temperature. If you look back at offices that you've worked in, and the discussions or debates you've had on the air conditioning or the heating. Should it be 2 degrees higher or lower, or where's the ducts? Is there a difference between men and women in body temperatures? Things like that. I would have always thought that it was temperature, but it's actually noise. So in a way, this is quite good for employers and designers if they want to be able to make a meaningful difference. And, as you said, based on what we spoke about in our earlier conversation, some people are aware of it and some people aren't. But if you have a workforce, how do you know the mix of people that you have? Notwithstanding the neurodiversity of people, but just simply preference as well. Do you have staff, or do you run a company which is predominantly lone working or collaboration? What kind of culture do you have? So as a designer, looking at whom you're designing for is really important. So, space planning. And this is something that, I'm not a workspace psychologist or an interior designer, but, when I look at the way offices are designed, the ones which are, in my opinion, better designed for better experience for the staff members, they accommodate the louder teams and the quieter teams. They separate them. Why would you have, for example, HR next to customer service or next to software development? There are certain teams which are quieter than others. So, planning for that, separating them or accommodating them with partitions or desk dividers, that type of thing, is really important. And as you say, all rooms have a specific acoustic characteristic. So if you're planning for an office that has, let's say a solicitor's where they have numerous offices, small meeting rooms within their office, they're all equally sized, they're all next to one another. I would hope that a designer, or I don't know which part of the design would decide the thickness of the partitions or the quality of the partitions, for example. But, I've been to plenty of offices where the partitions between those meeting rooms haven't been sufficient enough to adequately contain the sound. So that's when I was called in to address sound containment or speech privacy issues with offices next to one another, and particularly where you've got video conferencing solutions. So it's not just people talking, it's people talking somewhere else through a loudspeaker system. So the quality of that sound is slightly different. And then you have to consider the technology used as well, which is another matter entirely. But the room acoustics themselves, is affected by the ability to contain the sound within it, and also to allow the user inside that space to be able to function in it adequately, and also for it to not only be satisfactory in terms of its acoustic properties, but potentially noticeably satisfactory to its occupants. If you've been into a room which is very echoey and tried to have a call or a conversation, or you've been to a noisy cafe or pub or tried to have a conversation there, of course your vocal cords are straining, your ears are straining, your brain is working overtime trying to understand what the person's saying to you. Whereas you could have just gone to a quieter place to have that conversation. But when you're an employee and you have a meeting room for these types of meetings, or you have to have a conference with someone on the other side of the world, you're a bit limited on where to do it.
You're talking about adding on an awareness of acoustics to the design process there, where as designers, we're probably very comfortable in creating an office space with lots of different zones and soft and hard and group and individual. But whilst we're doing that, we need to be a bit more mindful of the acoustic qualities of those spaces, so that the activities are matched with the acoustic environment that helps promote that best.
Sure. And I would probably call that designing for both the eyes and the ears. And, it's probably something that maybe has traditionally been discussed in terms of architecture, because sometimes building architecture itself would lend itself to either good acoustics or not very good acoustics, but it depends on what the purpose of the building is. Same with the room as well. What's the purpose or the function of the room? If it's to have a conversation, then surely the ears are more important than the eyes. But if you're designing a piece of art, who cares what it sounds like? You want to be visually stunned. But the point is that in your office, people need to be able to concentrate. They need to be able to isolate themselves on occasion to be able to do that. And they need to generally have a space where they are limited to the exposure of annoying noise. And generally, annoying noise in offices is other people's conversations. that you're trying to ignore. I mean, some of them you shouldn't be listening to, some of them you don't want to listen to, depends on the content. Some of them might be highly confidential. Some of the offices I've visited have had a very specific problem where the boardroom is right next to the reception area, and without any injected sound into the reception area, it's very quiet. So when there's a conference happening in the boardroom with loudspeakers, because the conference is with someone somewhere else, it's actually quite loud. And the reception area, if you have visitors waiting in there or staff members, they can likely hear what's happening in the conference. So
everything that's going on, yeah,
it's a real problem.
You talked about some of the physical measures you can introduce, and I know that's part of your expertise, but also the other angle is the adding sound, the sound masking process, if that's the correct way to describe it.
Yes.
Yeah. Introducing more sound into an environment. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive on the surface of it. Injecting sound into an office actually has the effect of making us perceive that it's quieter. And sound masking is one of the treatments to look at, and the other is absorption as well, which we can come on to. But the sound masking it's really interesting. It's basically using a series of loudspeakers. You're creating a background sound in an open plan office or in a closed office. So instead of the office being very quiet, so if you imagine a library, some buildings I've been to where, they're designed to a very high specification, the ambient noise is very low because all of the technology is very modern, so maybe fanless and therefore quieter. You might be on the 15th floor of a building, so there's no traffic noise. So without humans creating the sound, the ambient noise is very low. Also, silence can be as distracting as noise. So one of the things that sound masking does is it raises the noise floor level to something more comfortable. So if you imagine ever being in an office that has air conditioning, for example, and at some point in the day it switches off, and it's almost as if someone's snatched the life from the office. Everything goes quiet and you start to notice things that you didn't notice before, like someone incessantly tapping on their desk, or a noisy typer, or someone's eating crisps that, I didn't notice that before, but it's there. But the noise of the air conditioning was covering that up. So sound masking is just a higher tech version of what air conditioning is essentially. It's a background sound, which in the case of sound masking is very specifically tuned to cover speech. So sometimes they're called speech privacy systems or sound masking systems, but their main aim is to cover speech. So in effect, you are reducing the intelligibility of the speech around you. So you're no longer able to comprehend the conversations. So if you imagine trying to block out muffled voices compared to very crystal clear voices, we know which one's easier to block out when we're trying to concentrate ourselves. So the more we can reduce the intelligibility of speech in offices, the more likely we are able to concentrate on our own work and also listen to our own thoughts.
What sort of noise is that, or sound? I need to work out which word to use, but is that like a white noise that we might be familiar with, the concept of white noise, the sort of...
Yeah, so I often get asked about this, or I often get called the white noise ladies here. White noise is a collection of frequencies which sound like the static that used to come out of the old CRT monitors. So white noise actually is very unpleasant, but traditionally sound masking systems had been known as white noise systems because, some had used that selection of frequencies. So these days we use something much more advanced than that, and we tailor the sound which is made around speech frequencies. So you're covering speech with something similar, because it's no good playing, I don't know, the London Symphony Orchestra, as beautiful as it may be, but it's not going to be very effective at covering speech because there are dips and highs in the music, and as soon as you hear a few words, you can make out the context of a sentence and then you can fill the gaps. So sound masking is a collection of frequencies, which we just call the speech masking curve. And that is a very stable sound. The collection of frequencies doesn't change, but the loudness of it does. So if you imagine in a open plan office, some days of the week or some times of the day, it's much quieter than others. Let's say Monday morning versus a Friday afternoon or a Tuesday afternoon. The soundscape of the office is very variable. Part of the sound masking technology that I work with uses something called adaptive noise sensing. That really basically means that in the open plan area where you have a greater variance of ambient noise, so it can either be as quiet as a library when everyone's, tired or very busy, and then it can be very noisy at times when, people are asking what do you want for lunch, or what are you up to at the weekend. So the adaptive sensing technology is constantly monitoring the ambient noise of the open plan office, and then it's telling the sound masking controller, you need to adjust up or down in relation to the ambient noise. In effect, what happens is when it's very quiet, the sound masking is reducing in its loudness, so you don't notice that it's there. And then at other times when the office is slightly louder, the sound masking is reacting accordingly, whilst still able to provide speech privacy. And that's the important thing. Speech privacy is also very closely linked to a reduction in distractions, because if you know that you can have a phone call at your office desk and know that people beyond 4 meters away from you in all directions can't really make out the words that you're saying, it means that you have speech privacy, and it also means that they enjoy limited distraction from your voice. But that affects everyone because you introduce sound masking in a blanket uniform way across the open plan office. Everyone's enjoying the benefits of the reduction in distractions and the increase in speech privacy.
So once people have got themselves into that environment, do you notice behavioural changes then, people adopting different patterns of activity? I suppose you're talking about someone feeling comfortable to make a phone call at their desk rather than thinking I must go and find a cubbyhole somewhere.
Yes, at an extreme end of the spectrum, you could say that, let's say you're on the 20th floor of a building and you just want to very quickly check up on the babysitter at home or the builder, or you'd like to make a call which is a bit tricky with a client or something like that. You might accept that at your desk you can't do that call with speech privacy. So you might wait till lunchtime or maybe towards the end of the day when there are fewer people around to be distracted by you or to overhear you. But sometimes, you have to take a call whenever it comes. So you might think, okay, well, I'll just leave the building and find somewhere on the street outside. So you're very high up in your high-rise building, you go to the lift, you wait for a lift, you go all the way down, you find somewhere quiet to have the call outside. So, and then you have to, in reverse, come back up. So in effect, a 5-minute call could take 25 minutes or half an hour before you're back at your desk doing what you should have been doing. So sometimes the cost of not having speech privacy is invisible.
You're coming into those environments where you're asked to sort of retrofit these systems. What's the best way for interior designers to avoid needing that and getting it right or trying to get it right first time round? What sort of tips should we be thinking about in terms of design?
Sure. So there's ultimately the result is the same. There are different treatments you can make, different design features that you can introduce. So we've talked about sound masking. One of the other acoustic treatments is absorption and diffusion of sound. So if you have an open plan office or even smaller meeting rooms or a corridor, understanding how the sound is behaving in those spaces will help us to figure out how we can manage that. So if you have a corridor, for example, and it's got a concrete or a hardwood floor, and people are walking up and down it, it's going to be quite reverberant. And reverberant just means that it sounds echoey. So a highly reverberant space will be very echoey, and it just means that the noise is amplified by the fact that the sound isn't being absorbed by anything whilst it's travelling. So if you install a absorbent panel on the walls or the ceilings, when the sound generated is bounced from that surface, instead of being reflected almost perfectly, its loudness is reduced because a lot of the energy is being absorbed by the panel itself. It's the same with a meeting room as well. Having a perfectly square or rectangular meeting room just means that any sound generated is being reflected between two parallel surfaces. And unless there's some absorption introduced there, the sound is hanging around for longer than it needs to hang around. And this affects our speech intelligibility as well. So in terms of effectively communicating with one another, if you're discussing something with someone in a reverberant space, let's say a slightly boxy meeting room, that has very shiny, smooth surfaces. All those surfaces do is serve to keep reflecting those sound waves. So when you're speaking to someone, there's a percentage of your speech which is direct speech, which goes directly to the ears of the person you're speaking to. Another speech kind of goes out to the side, reflects off the surface, and then reaches the listener. But there's a slight delay there between direct speech and indirect speech. So what that means is your brain is working harder to extrapolate the meaning and to accustom your hearing to what you're listening to. And then again, that's where the mental fatigue comes in, because the longer you do that, the more tiring it is. And it's the same with doing conference calls from your laptop speakers. They're designed to do everything. So speech playback is one of the things it's designed to do. So if you're using big sort of sound system speakers, for example, to listen to speech, the frequencies associated with speech are very different to what those loudspeakers might be geared up to deliver. How we perceive that sound is different to the original voice if we were hearing it in person. And that's one of the things that's really important. The more natural sound is, the better. Coming back to the question about what can designers do, first of all, having a consideration for the acoustics is such a huge step in the right direction, because it just means that you will ask the right questions. Even if you don't know what the questions are, you might find the right people to ask. Knowing that acoustics does affect well-being and the functionality of rooms in particular, just knowing that for starters is brilliant, knowing that it's an issue. And then being able to identify, well, what is the problem? And normally it's two main problems. It's either a distraction or a privacy issue. If you're thinking about where do I put this team or that team, or where do I put the meeting rooms? Do I even have meeting rooms, or do I just have collaboration areas? What technology is being put into those spaces? So imagining yourself as each of those people in that area, you know, thinking about what you're being exposed to sound-wise instead of just visually is really important. My understanding of absorption is if you plan for between 25 and 30% surface area coverage with an absorbent material, that's really where the end user would notice a perceivable difference in the soundscape. So as a designer designing a meeting room, think about putting absorbent paneling on about 25 to 30% of the surface area, because if you don't, it's likely that after the occupants have arrived, they'll say, we've got a problem here. You know, what can be done about it? And then that's when people start thinking, oh my God, well, what can be done about it? What do I need? Do I need builders in again? Do I need to build the partition up to the slab? Or is it okay up to the suspended ceiling?
That's when the panic sets in and you think, I don't really know the answer to it. But that 20 to 30% benchmark is a useful rule of thumb there. Well, we may intuitively think, we know what to put in, curtains, soft furnishings, but actually it's being mindful of both the material selection and also the activities, because some activities might not need that as much, but
sure,
bit of common sense and then a bit of specialist knowledge. And there's lots of products actually out there, aren't there, acoustic products that absorb sound?
There are, and once you go down that road, it's important to learn about the different classifications of absorbency panels. The highly rated ones are class A, and they absorb more sound than, let's say, class E absorbers. So when you look at the 25 to 30% value, that's with a higher class of absorber. You know, you could fill your room with class E absorber and not make as much of a difference as you could with filling it with 30% of class A in strategic positions, because where you put them is important as well. Looking at how the person is using the room, looking at where the most effective way to put the absorbent panel is, you know, where you get the first reflections of speech, either from a human or from a loudspeaker. So there are, you know, when I first started looking into absorption and diffusion of sound, and diffusion just means instead of hitting a sound which is completely absorbent, it hits a surface which then scatters the reflection. So you reduce the energy of the reflection as it's going in different directions rather than keeping it in one channel. When I first started learning about this, it was like a whole new world of science that was up to when I decided it was important, because the moment I decided it was important to learn about this was when people were phoning me about sound masking, and I would go and visit their space, and actually what they had predominantly was a reverberation issue. So it was too much noise in the space, and you really have to strike a nice balance between absorption and ambient noise, because you don't want your meeting room to sound like a recording studio. You know, if it's too quiet, it's unnatural again, and we don't like it. It makes us feel uncomfortable. And the way acoustics makes us feel is, if you think about going to a big church or a cathedral, when you walk into that space, you feel that you're in a big cavernous space because of how sound is traveling. If you closed your eyes, you could say, yeah, I'm not in my living room, in my nice cozy living room. I'm in a big cavernous, stony glass place. And that's purely based on how the sound is behaving in that space. So again, your living room versus a church or cathedral has a very different acoustic characteristic. So the treatments that you would use would be different depending on what you're trying to achieve. But overall, a reduction in the reverberation time is desirable. And there are parameters set for reverberation time and for sound masking levels in the International Wellbeing Institute guide. I'm sure a lot of designers have come across that. It's a high quality, interesting document that talks about all of the measures you could take to improve the wellness of the people inside a building.
Yeah, something I've come across, and that's one of the areas which is really interesting in terms of the impact you can have, although probably one of the most challenging in the sense that it's not something you can see. You can tell whether the colour of a space doesn't feel right or it's not the quite right atmosphere. The sound, although we instinctively respond to it, it's not tangible, is it, in a visual sense, which makes it, for designers who like to look at things and create things to look at, it's a hard dimension to deal with.
Yeah, and it's certainly a good time to seek advice. Whether you know the ins and outs of sound masking or sound absorption is irrelevant, as long as you recognise that you need to seek advice on it. Whether that's from an acoustic consultant or you do your own research, knowing that it has an effect is really important.
We've talked a lot about the office environment. That's not the only place where sound happens. And you've done a lot of research in the medical area on the impact of noise on both patients and the people that are working in those environments.
Unfortunately, if you are admitted to a hospital environment, that's a whole new soundscape that you're not really familiar with. Sleep, we all know that your first night in a hotel on holiday is a bit weird. You don't really sleep properly. There's new noises, the bed's funny, you can't remember where the bathroom is, so you've got to turn the light on. It's something that you have to get used to. When you are in a hospital, when you are maybe feeling unwell, or you're a visitor, you're visiting someone who's feeling unwell, or you work there, that is your workplace. Yes, you're right, we have been predominantly speaking about office staff, but there are staff of hospitals, doctors, nurses, clinicians, porters. We're hearing a lot about those people on media today and the hard work that they're doing, and sound affects them too. So when you're in hospital as a patient, you're not your normal self. The soundscape of a hospital, even in your imagination, if you've never visited one, you can imagine there's lots of beeps, there's lots of unfamiliar noises, there's voices of people you don't know, and it's constant. Even during nighttime, if you've been to a hospital or slept in a hospital, you know that the noise is constant. You're checked on all the time. Different patients on the ward have different schedules. Sometimes they match yours, sometimes they don't. So when you're in a vulnerable state, your well-being is of even more importance than just going to work every day. If you are staying in hospital for a long time, the ability to be able to sleep soundly is very important for your recovery. In hospitals, the soundscape is alien. It's stressful, it's uncomfortable, and isn't really conducive to feeling good or getting better. So I collaborated through my company Sound Directions, with University of Arts London, and I've written this down because I always get it mixed up, the Florence Nightingale Faculty of Nursing, Midwifery and Palliative Care, and King's College London. And we all worked together, or I participated in their body of research on noise, sound and sleep in hospitals. The workshop was set up to provide a holistic understanding of the relationship between noise and health, and in particular recovery. So During the workshop, we looked at different methods of addressing or managing sound. So we had noise cancelling headphones, we had sleep headphones, they're kind of flat and go on your ears and you could sleep in them, and also sound masking. What we discovered in hospitals, 40% of noise is communication, and that's vital communication. That's nurses talking to one another, or nurses talking to patients, doctors to patients, staff talking amongst one another. So it's not really noise that you could just ask to stop. It has to happen. We looked at the impact of these various uses of technology on managing the soundscape. And although it was a small pilot study, what we found was that sound masking was the most relaxing and interesting sound. One hospital where we have used sound masking, which it's turned out to be very effective, is in Dublin, where it's a children's hospital, and one of the functions of this particular ward is to encourage children to fall asleep for about an hour whilst they run some tests, and then they run some tests when they've just woken up as well. And it's a 24-hour period where the child and the guardian are supposed to be present. When we introduced sound masking to those 2 sleep rooms, the staff noticed an exponential increase in how easily and how long the child would stay asleep for. And you can imagine working with, children and guardians in that scenario is quite emotional. So being able to achieve that for them was really satisfying for the soul. It's great that we give sound masking and acoustic treatment to banks and corporate offices, but at the same time it's very nice to know that you've made a little difference to people's lives.
I think in the healthcare context it really becomes obviously apparent that it's a benefit in terms of recovery. And in an environment that you can't really design out, like you say, you can't really design out all the things that are there, because they're important to the maintenance and the running of the organisation. So adding that layer of sound masking with the impact it has sounds like a brilliant idea.
It's often something that I speak about when sometimes some people ask me, well, is it harmful, sound masking? Is exposure to this sound going to hurt me over time, or will it cause headaches or things like that? And that's really when I talk about sound masking in a healthcare environment. And this technology isn't as popular here as it is in other parts of the world, predominantly America. The fact that we use it in hospitals to aid recovery is really telling. Sound masking isn't loud. That's one of the questions I get asked quite a lot. Well, it's not really a question, it's more of a statement. Well, I don't want sound masking because I want to be able to hear the person next to me. That's a really common objection that I hear. And my response to that is, well, you will still be able to hear the person next to you. I'm sorry, but sound masking isn't an invisible wall that's going to block sound. This is going to be effective over a distance. So, everybody has a radius of distraction in the office or in any environment. If you introduced sound masking to a big open plan office, you would still be able to hear people within a 5-meter radius of you. No doubt about it. It's the people beyond that would benefit. So it's not going to be louder than the person sitting next to you. You will still be able to hear yourself think. And as I said before, sound masking is specifically designed to be invisible. It should form part of the building structure and react to the ambient noise. So it's designed to not be noticeable.
I think, like all good bits of design, that's the aim, isn't it? To contribute to the atmosphere and the experience without being too in your face or in your ears.
Really, as I said before, it's just an educational one. How a designer would incorporate these treatments into the space, or how they would manage them. You really have a lot of power in your position as an interior designer. You could potentially make someone's day very happy or very annoying. And that's one of the beauties of sound masking is, I genuinely feel that the sound masking and sound absorption really do make a difference. It's about knowing the right space to put.
It's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? It's something that you don't notice, and you don't possibly notice that it's making a difference, but actually it's doing that in the background. That's the concept, isn't it, really?
I'm supposed to summarise the acoustic treatments. There's an A and a B and a C of acoustics: absorption, blocking and covering. The absorption is partitions or walls or panelling. Blocking is desk dividers or screens themselves, blocking the transmission of sound. and the covering is the sound masking. It's good to strike a balance between the A's and the B's and the C's, because again, you don't want it too quiet, you don't want it too lively. This isn't something that you should just expect to learn in a 30-minute online course. This is something that takes a bit of time to build up. So as an interior designer, visiting offices, that's your learning, seeing what works, what doesn't, really thinking about what you're hearing, because not a lot of people do. Maybe these days, when we're less busy or we're in the same place for a long time, you do start to notice more things about what you can hear. But if you did that any day of the week, even when you're super busy, if you gave yourself the mental space to do that, you would be able to hear more. And I suppose it's a way of being mindful of your surroundings.
Picking up the sound. I think that's really important.
This topic, it can be complicated, but at the same time, demystifying all of these concepts is really useful step to understanding it and understanding what you know, and more importantly, understanding what you don't know.
I'd like to thank Hanieh for taking the time to talk to me. Her specialist knowledge highlights the difficulty for interior designers to get their heads around how to manage sound, but her tips on visiting office spaces and observing the design of well-accredited office spaces provides some practical tips that can help interior designers become more familiar with what works, and also to begin asking the questions and reaching out to specialists like Hanieh for support and advice during the design process. I'd like to thank Dave Clark from I Am The How for production support and invaluable advice in the setting up of this podcast, Kay Hansen for her planning support and co-hosting role for these and our educational podcasts at the University of Plymouth, and Mark Frith for the music. Next week we feature lighting specialist David Amos. I'd really like to hear your feedback on the podcast. Leave a comment or get in touch. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.